Hello, good afternoon. Events have been taking place in London to mark 20 years since the July the 7th bombings. 52 people died in what is one of the biggest ever terrorist attacks on British soil. This morning, a special memorial service was held in St Paul's Cathedral.
Behnaz Mazaka. Michaela Otto.
Saba Edwards, whose mother died near King's Cross during the attacks, read out the names of the victims, including her mum's, while 52,000 white petals to represent the 52 people who lost their lives fell from the ceiling of St Paul's Dome. The service saw the country's leaders, along with the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, members of the emergency services and the family of survivors, join together to remember those who lost their lives. Between hymns and readings, some were invited to speak about their loved ones lost that day, including Graham Folks, whose son David was killed at Edgware Road Station.
These four pieces of London epitomise what is great about this city: an international crossroads of diversity and ingenuity, tolerance and respect, challenge and opportunity. When four bombs exploded on the 7th of July 2005, lives were destroyed and the flame of hope faltered for what seemed like an eternal moment. For many people, nothing was the same again. And yet everything was the same again, because the good which is in Londoners and the countless visitors who they host at any given moment is not erased by hatred or by threat, or rather is fostered to produce a harvest of hope for each generation.
The King has called on the country to remember the extraordinary courage and compassion in the face of the horrors of the bombing, as well as the importance of standing against those who seek to divide. In a message to the nation, King Charles said, "Today, as we mark 20 years since the tragic events of the 7th of July 2005, my heartfelt thoughts and special prayers remain with all those whose lives were forever changed on that terrible summer's day. While the horrors will never be forgotten, we may take comfort from the way such events rally communities together in solidarity, solace and determination. It is this spirit of unity that has helped London and our nation to heal." And this was the scene earlier this morning at Hyde Park at 8:50 a.m. This is the exact time that the first bomb went off 20 years ago. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and the London Mayor Sadiq Khan laid wreaths at the 7/7 Memorial Gardens.
Today marks 20 years since that horrible, horrendous day that shook London. We come together today to remember those 52 people whose lives were cruelly cut short by this cowardly act of terrorism. The thoughts and prayers of all of us are with their families. We pay tribute to the emergency personnel, the transport workers, the extraordinary Londoners who came to the aid, ran towards danger, brave in a very brave way, selflessly to support those who'd been injured. And we honour the survivors and bereaved who are coming together today. It's been 20 years, but none of us can forget what happened on that day. I remember as an MP being in Parliament, frantically ringing my wife to check she was okay. She had checked that my siblings were okay, my nephews and nieces, my staff, ringing around to make sure everyone you knew and loved was okay, because most of us use the tube, most of us use the buses, and none of us knew whether our family loved ones were safe. None of us knew whether there'd be further terrorist attacks on that day. What we did see, though, was some remarkable acts of kindness, of bravery. It's a reminder that actually London stood together. And we've got to remind ourselves that what these terrorists seek to do is to drive a wedge between different communities. They seek to sow division and hatred. And London stood united, not just against the terrorists, but united supporting each other. I was a Member of Parliament for 11 years. I've been the Mayor for 9 years. I meet on a daily basis members of our blue light services that literally run towards danger, encouraging the rest of us to go towards safety. On that day, you saw transport workers risking their own lives to support those that had been injured, but also extraordinary civilians being guardian angels, supporting those who'd been hurt. And that's who we are. That's what London is all about. And the message we want to send today to anybody thinking about future cowardly acts of terrorism is: you will not defeat us. You know, you will not cower us. We will not forget those whose lives were cut short, those 52 people, men and women, for different backgrounds. We have in our thoughts and prayers their families, but also we're resilient, we're stoic, and we stand united.
Sky's crime correspondent Martin Brunt has the latest from St Paul's.
I think it was a memorial that managed to be what all memorials aspire to be: powerful, moving, sad, and ultimately uplifting. And I think the centrepiece were 4 secular readings about the areas where the bombs went off. A brief reflection in each. I mean, these weren't very long pieces, but a brief reflection on the history and the diversity of those 4 areas. And they were read by the wife of a survivor, one of the police responders, the mother of a victim, and the bus driver who survived the bus blast at Tavistock Square. And then there was a 5th reflection by the father of a young man who died in the blast. This was Graham Fawkes, who was on Sky News this morning. His son had travelled down from the north. Graham Fawkes did a kind of 5th reflection, pulling together the themes of those 4 pieces that we'd just heard. And he said this, and I'll read this bit out. This is a quotation from what Graham Fawkes said. These 4 pieces of London epitomise what is great about this city: an international crossroads of diversity and ingenuity, tolerance and respect, challenge and opportunity. I suppose the most moving moment came midway through when the names of all 52 who died in those 4 blasts were read out. One by a survivor and one by the relative of somebody who died. It was a very, very fitting tribute, and for those who weren't able to watch the live feed of the service, there were 52,000 flower petals that descended from the roof of the cathedral to the floor.
King Charles has called on the country to remember the extraordinary courage and compassion shown in the face of the July the 7th bombings. 20 years ago, 52 people died in what is one of the biggest ever terror attacks on British soil. It was around 8:50 in the morning of July the 7th. Bombs were detonated at Edgware Road, Russell Square and Aldgate Underground stations. A 4th device exploded on a bus an hour later, which was on diversion through Tavistock Square. Victims and survivors have reflected on the atrocity with Sky's community correspondent Lisa Holland.
Arriving in London for the anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, the family of David Fawkes, who died at Edgware Road. David was from Oldham and in London meeting a work colleague. He was just 22 years old.
20 lost years. Can you talk to us about that?
As I said a few minutes ago, we're just an ordinary working class family from Oldham, but we should have a son, and he should have his family. And I shouldn't be having this conversation with you. I should be at home at this time having dinner or going to the pub with David. And it's not possible to describe the feeling of having your son murdered in such a pointless way.
Over the last 20 years, Graham Fawkes has become a leading campaigner for the victims' families. He still believes there are unanswered questions about events leading up to the attacks and what was known about the bombers.
The public inquiry is the only way, because at a public inquiry, people can be compelled to come and give evidence. At an inquest, they can just say, no, I'm not coming, and that's what happened.
Others share that view, like Adrian Hiley, who survived the Edgware Road attack. In spite of his own injuries, the former combat medic was credited with saving the life of fellow passenger Danny Biddle.
Initially it was just dead quiet, and then a lot of people started screaming. It's a different type of scream, fear and pain. And Danny was bleeding a lot through his leg, and I had to sort of stem the blood flow to use my belt and my shirt as a tourniquet. I remember putting my hands into saying to Danny, "This is going to hurt," and I put my hands into his leg to try and find his femoral artery or try to stem the blood while I put the tourniquet on.
In London's Hyde Park, steel pillars now stand in remembrance of those who died. To mark the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 attacks, survivors and bereaved families will gather for a special memorial service, remembering the 52 people who lost their lives and the more than 700 who were injured. In the 2 decades that have passed since those lives were taken, the Metropolitan Police say lessons have been learned, with a significant shift in its response to counter-terrorism.
The changes that brought policing and our security services, particularly MI5, much more close together, so that we now have the closest joint operating arrangements anywhere in the world. And secondly, counter-terrorism work became something that wasn't just about what was based in London, and a network was built with bases in all of the regions across the country.
20 years after 7/7, the government says Islamist and right-wing extremism continue to pose Britain's biggest threats. Lisa Holland, Sky News.
I'm delighted to say that we can now speak to Adam Wishart, a documentary maker and author of the book 3 Weeks in July, and Paul Dadge, a former firefighter who gave first aid to victims. This picture of him helping one of those victims whose face had been burnt badly is one of the images that stuck in people's minds 20 years ago. A very good morning to you both. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning.
Paul, if I can start with you, take us back to that moment, not even when you started helping people, but the moment when the attacks unfolded and you became aware of them.
Yeah, so we say aware of the attacks, but I wasn't aware of the attacks until I actually saw it on Sky News at 12:15 in the afternoon, the bomb where I was at 10 to 9 in the morning. But I'd come across what was happening at Edgware Road Tube Station and decided that I wanted to do what I could to help the people who were at that scene there.
And what kind of kicked in for you there? Your firefighter's training? Was it your moral compass?
I've always said that I don't think it was that. It was the moral compass. It was just common sense that there was a group of people who'd clearly been involved in an incident, and people who weren't involved were starting to mill in with that group, and I wanted to make sure that they were looked after. And the picture that was taken was we'd been evacuated from the Marks and Spencer store where we'd been. So there was concern about a secondary device, and we ran across the road and were pictured running across that road. And
Adam, in terms of trying to retell the moment 20 years ago and to capture the emotion of it all, stories like Paul's are crucial tool in your filmmaking.
Yeah, we wanted to make a series about those incredible 3 weeks, and the story goes from Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, to Ian Blair, the Commissioner of Police, to those people on the ground, first responders like Paul, but also the survivors and the victims.
And explain to us a little bit more of some of that kind of moment that you captured in the film that you've obviously gone through with your book and the filmmaking, the shock and how the UK responded.
Well, I think it's difficult looking back because we understand them to be suicide bombers, but at the time nobody knew what they were or what was going to happen. And the fear within the security services was that these were the explosions that were the first of a wave or a series of bombs that were going to come and devastate London in the weeks to come. And so for the police, it was a race against time to find out who had done this. You know, was it a suicide bomb or had they just left bags on the tube? And if there was a network, was the network armed and prepared and willing to do more attacks in the days to come? And so the police were working at breakneck speed to find out what was at the crime scenes, but also to look at all the CCTV to try and find out who did it and if another attack could be prevented.
Paul, you're obviously a former firefighter. Do you look back on how all of the emergency services responded in that moment with admiration, were you impressed or?
Yeah, I think the emergency services are kind of the forgotten heroes, if you like, from the day. A very traumatic day for those, especially the police recovery teams who had to work underground in ridiculous temperatures. And it's suffice to say that those emergency services are much more prepared now than they were in 2005. The ambulance service, for instance, they're called hazardous area response teams that are made up of paramedics who respond to deal with incidents with mass casualties, which we didn't have in 2005. So I do think that we're a lot better prepared. It was difficult being on the scene of something like that because I wasn't aware of what was happening outside of Edgware Road, and I remember thinking, where are all the emergency services? And it wasn't until I saw a picture of the bus and I thought that the bus roof had been ripped off, and I thought, never mind that, you want to be down here at Edgware Road, and then realised as the Sky ticker came across the screen saying explosions across London, that I realised the full extent of the...
So when you were first there on site, around lunchtime or whenever it was, were you aware there was a terrorist attack and a series of terrorist attacks?
So I arrived probably about 9:10 in the morning, so the bombs went off at 9:10. I was there about 9:10, and it was 12:15 in the afternoon before we realised it was a terrorist attack. Until that point, everybody who was coming out of the tube, they were talking about a power surge, and I had no reason to question that, but the smell from that day will always remain with me. I've never smelt it since. It was just like an acrid burning smell.
Adam, in terms of that fear that there could be many more attacks to come, in your filmmaking and politicians, police and security services that you spoke to, I mean, gauge for us how big a scale of that fear was. How did it compare, say, to the same sort of US fear following 9/11?
Well, it was pretty intense. I mean, Tony Blair tells a story that in the days after 7/7, he was given intelligence that there was an imminent threat of an attack, that a new bomb was going to go off. And he, as the Prime Minister, had to make a decision. Should you keep the London transport system open and prevent it, or should you close it down? And in the end, he made the judgment that the intelligence was unlikely to be correct, that it was just one of the kind of flim-flam of ideas that fly around at this point, and decided to keep London transport open. But he acknowledges in the book that, you know, had it gone wrong, he would have been the person to blame. And so there was a very real and serious fear that more was going to happen, and subsequently 2 weeks later there was another set of bombs, albeit they didn't go off because one of the lead bombers had failed his GCSE chemistry.
It's crazy to think about all of those sorts of details. In terms of the threat level and our ability to respond, have you done any kind of assessment or your thoughts towards that? I mean, I guess we're much more aware of these sorts of threats that exist today, but...
Well, these were the first homegrown suicide bombs on British soil, and so it was a kind of revelation and a new thing. And, you know, the book describes the process from 2001, from 9/11 until 2005. And during that period, the intelligence services were tracking and disrupting plots and being moderately successful, albeit the bombers of 7/7 were always just over the periphery. They could see them, but they weren't a priority. And so subsequent to 2005, there was a massive investment in the security services, and there were different methods to tackle these people. And to some extent, the security services have been successful, but the problem is, you know, you just need one lone wolf to come at you. And but there haven't been, you know, since 2006, there haven't been such sophisticated networks of people, often controlled or advised from abroad, because those networks have been disrupted.
Paul, final word in terms of 20 years on, the kind of lasting impact that all of this has had on you?
My life has been somewhat carved from what happened as a result of 7/7. I'm very much in touch with what happens in terrorism. I'm very much involved in politics now. I'm a bit of a troublemaker for the government. Emergency response units were canned in 2005 because they couldn't actually get through to the emergency because they didn't have blue lights. So one of the recommendations that came out was to have blue lights, but 19 years later, those blue lights have now been removed. So these are kind of things that I now look at and go, why are we doing these things? Well, these were recommendations. So I think I'll always be somebody that's a vocal critic when it needs to be made of lessons that haven't been learned.
Paul and Adam, thanks both for joining us. Much appreciated on this 20th anniversary of those 7/7 bombings.